get behind the words and you see that this whole world is just mulligans all the way up. It's just shenanigans all the way to the east and all the way to the west. It's just ridiculous. Hello everybody, I'm Mango Thunderslice, and today we're talking more about the Iran situation. Iran has admitted to shooting down the civilian airliner that was flying out of the country right basically at the same time the missiles were flying out of Iran towards the Iraqi U.S. air bases. And, you know, it's a very complex situation. This has definitely turned the tide of sympathy against Iran. But, you know, there's a lot of things coming out now, and just going to cover more about this because this is pretty much the biggest news story that's going on in the world right now as far as I can tell with regard to geopolitics. So, yeah, this is a photo of the Iranian protests that are happening today for a second day in a row. You know, several hundred, looks like, you know, at least maybe a couple thousand of protesters out on the streets, a lot of them students, protesting the Iranian government's response and handling of the airliner downing. Of course, because for the first few days they denied that it had been shot down. They said it was a technical glitch. And then only when, you know, the Ukrainian investigators were about to decode the black box and get the answers for themselves did they come out and admit that they had shot down the plane. And it's a very sad situation, right? You know, what is it with Iran and military conflicts and civilian airlines get shot down, right? From 1988 onward, just seems to be a thing that happens sometimes. Back then it was on the U.S. The U.S. accidentally shot down a plane, and now the Iranians have accidentally shot down a plane. And, you know, as some of these articles that we'll read in a second point out, it's just very interesting that the Iranian regime was so careful not to hit any U.S. Service members, but nobody even thought to shut down the airport, right? If you're going to start lobbing missiles right over the airport in your country, I think, you know, I mean, I'm not an airline management specialist, but I would think you would shut down the airplane if you're about to start firing missiles over it. So anyway, here we go. First one is Wall Street Journal. This is titled, Iran faces growing criticism at home and abroad over downing of Ukrainian plane. Hundreds protested in Tehran to express their anger with Iran's leadership. Iran's leaders worked to contain international criticism and anger at home over their admission that the armed forces accidentally shot down a Ukrainian passenger airliner after they initially denied it. Additional security forces were deployed outside a university in Tehran to prevent protests on Sunday, a day after hundreds of people took to the streets of the capital to express their anger at what they have called lying and incompetence by the country's leadership. All 176 people on board the Boeing Co. 737-800 airliner were killed, including dozens of Iranians. Anger over the strike places further pressure on Iran's leaders, already challenged by the U.S. sanctions that have prompted an economic crisis and helped trigger public protests. As domestic anger simmered, Iran faced more criticism for its handling of the protests. A tweet in Persian from President Trump's account on Saturday offered his support for the protests. On Sunday, he appealed to Iran's leadership. Quote, "Do not kill your protesters," he tweeted. "Thousands have already been killed or imprisoned by you, and the world is watching. More importantly, the USA is watching. Turn your internet back on and let reporters roam free. Stop the killing of your great Iranian people." Tehran's admission came after its denial of Western claims that the plane had been hit by an Iranian missile. The military shot down the plane on Wednesday as its air defenses were on high alert for a potential U.S. response, hours after launching missile strikes against U.S. forces in Iraq in retaliation for the killing of a top general. The commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said he wished he had been on the plane, so he wouldn't have felt so ashamed in front of the nation. Major General Hossein Salami's comments, delivered in a closed session to his deputies on Sunday and reported by the semi-official Fars news agency, appeared aimed at alleviating some of the anger at the country's leaders. White House National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien on Sunday said the Trump administration backed Iranians protesting their government. "What's interesting is that they're chanting 'death to the dictator,'" Mr. O'Brien said on Fox News, a reference to Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And real quick, here's a little diagram of the missile that supposedly took down the plane and the mobile launcher. So as many speculated, this was some, guy of the IRGC, and he saw a plane and supposedly was coming near to the base, and he just didn't know what to do and fired a missile at it. It's a very sad situation of incompetence in the Iranian military. In Iraq, meanwhile, several rockets were fired at the Balad Air Base, which has hosted U.S. troops from the U.S.-led coalition, security officials said. 6 Iraqi soldiers were injured, an Interior Ministry official said. It wasn't clear whether coalition troops remain there because the U.S.-led coalition has repositioned troops. It was the second time rockets have been launched at bases hosting troops from the U.S.-led coalition since Iran fired a barrage of missiles in retaliation for the killing of Major General Qasem Soleimani. Although Iran appeared to signal it was stepping back from the conflict with the U.S., the continuing rocket attacks demonstrate the potential for armed groups in Iraq to inflame tensions. With regard to Soleimani, Mr. O'Brien said on NBC, quote, "We had exquisite intelligence. The intelligence showed that they were looking at U.S. facilities throughout the region and that they wanted to inflict casualties on American soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, as well as diplomats." The British ambassador to Iran, Rob Macaire, was briefly detained during protests. Mr. Macaire denied taking part in the demonstrations outside of Amr Kabir University of Technology in Tehran. He said he was in the area to attend a vigil for the victims of the plane crash and left as soon as people started chanting slogans, but was detained 30 minutes later. A British official said Mr. Macaire was arrested at a barber shop while making his way back to the embassy. Quote, "He wasn't detained but arrested as an unknown foreigner in an illegal gathering," Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said on Twitter. "When police informed me a man's arrested who claims to be UK ambassador, I said, impossible. Only after my phone conversation with him, I identified out of big surprise that it's him. 15 minutes later, he was free." So even this tweet right here, quick aside from me, that the sheer tone of this tweet indicates that the Iranian regime is kind of scrambling right now to maintain any shreds of kind of international credibility that they have. This is not really solemn, and kind of diplomatic speech. This is very much like, oh, no, we let him out, We're not detaining any ambassadors, right? Because their best play here is to get the rest of the world on their side as much as possible against the U.S. But a lot of these interactions that they've had, not just with the U.S., which of course is, hostile, but with the U.K., and with Ukraine and, with a lot of other European countries who they kind of need to woo right now, they're not doing such a great job. Continuing on with the article. Iran's foreign ministry on Sunday summoned Mr. Macaire, saying the presence of foreign ambassadors in what it called illegal gatherings contradicted the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which allows diplomats to perform their function without fear of coercion or harassment by the host country, and demanding an explanation from the UK government, Iran's ISNA news agency reported. UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab sharply rebuked Iran for the detention, calling it a flagrant violation of international law. Quote, "The Iranian government is at a crossroads moment. It can continue its march towards pariah status with all the political and economic isolation that entails, or take steps to de-escalate tensions and engage in a diplomatic path forward," Mr. Raab said. Mr. Macaire's detention and Iran's delay in admitting to shooting down the plane are threatening Iran's relations with its European partners, on whom Tehran relies to avoid international isolation and to keep alive the 2015 nuclear deal, which the U.S. left in 2018. The Trump administration has imposed harsh economic sanctions aimed at forcing Iran to curtail its nuclear and conventional weapons programs and rolling back its military presence in the Middle East. Joseph Borrell, the European Union's foreign policy chief, said he was very concerned about the detention. Full respect of the Vienna Convention is a must. The EU calls for de-escalation and space for diplomacy, Mr. Borrell said on Twitter. Amid the tensions with Europe, Qatari ruler Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani landed in Tehran to meet Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, his first visit since becoming emir in 2013. Qatar has good relations with Washington and Tehran and has previously made efforts to mediate between the two. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif also on Sunday visited Oman to offer his condolences for Sultan Qaboos. The anger in Iran stood in contrast to the massive show of national unity days earlier when hundreds of thousands of Iranians came together in multi-day funeral processions for Mr. Soleimani. And actually, during that funeral, 59 Iranians were stampeded to death. Right, it's a very bad situation, right? The airstrike of taking out Soleimani was one thing, But now between the stampedes at his funeral and the shooting down of the jet, right, Iran, through its, incompetence at managing various different situations, has allowed, far more people to die than otherwise had to, And people will blame Trump for starting the whole thing. But, these ones are purely on Iran's head, right? This is their fault. Iran's admission came only after Ukrainian investigators found evidence that a missile strike caused the crash, Ukrainian officials said. They said the evidence forced Tehran to admit it accidentally shot down the jet. Here's a little diagram of the path where the airport and it was taking off, right? And, I don't know exactly where these missile bases were that were launching the missiles, but, in any case, what they said that the plane was approaching a military base in Iran, and so some guy, down on the ground said, that he was alarmed and he fired the missile. Just not very good. Why didn't they shut down the airport? It's so stupid. A team of 45 experts from Ukraine arrived on the scene less than 24 hours after the crash and began sending hourly reports to Kiev. By late Friday, based on evidence from the team and information shared by the U.S. and other Western nations, Ukraine had concluded that the most likely reason for the crash was a missile strike, a person familiar with the matter said. Ukraine is continuing with its investigation, Ukrainian Prime Minister Oleksiy Honcharuk said. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Kiev insisted on an official apology by Iran and expected Tehran to punish those responsible. The Iranian acknowledgement will lessen the importance of an international investigation, which was just starting to take shape, as it rules out the role of any mechanical issue resulting in the disaster. The downing of the Ukrainian jet isn't the first time tensions between the U.S. and Iran have led to an aviation tragedy. In 1988, the U.S. Navy's USS Vincennes warship downed Iran Air Flight 655 with an air defense missile. U.S. officials said they mistook the Airbus SE-A300 Airliner for a warplane they feared would attack the ship. All 290 people, mostly Iranian, on the plane died, prompting an outpouring of national grief in Iran. The U.S. agreed to pay compensation to Iranian victims nearly a decade after the incident. And so another one from the Wall Street Journal as of yesterday that's very interesting is Trump has essentially warned Iraq that if they force the U.S. troops out of the country, that they're going to cut off Iraq's Federal Reserve account, which they hold a lot of their government reserves in, which is very interesting. So I'll read a little bit of this. U.S. warns Iraq it risks losing access to key bank account if troops are told to leave. A loss of access to its New York Fed account, where international oil sale revenue is kept, risks creating cash crunch in Iraq's financial system. The Trump administration warned Iraq this week that it risks losing access to a critical government bank account if Baghdad kicks out American forces following the U.S. airstrike that killed a top Iranian general, according to Iraqi officials. The State Department warned that the U.S. could shut down Iraq's access to the country's central bank account held at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a move that could jolt Iraq's already shaky economy, the officials said. Iraq, like other countries, maintains government accounts at the New York Fed as an important part of managing the country's finances, including revenue from oil sales. Loss of access to the accounts could restrict Iraq's use of that revenue, creating cash crunch in Iraq's financial system and constricting a critical lubricant for the economy. The prospect of U.S. sanctions against Iraq arose after the January 3rd U.S. airstrike that killed Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani at Baghdad International Airport. The Iraqi parliament voted Sunday to urge Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi to work toward the expulsion of the approximately 5,300 U.S. troops. In response to the non-binding resolution, which was backed by the Prime Minister, President Trump threatened to impose sanctions against Iraq if the U.S. was forced to withdraw its troops. Mr. Abdul Mahdi moved ahead with those plans this week, requesting the U.S. agree to talks to plan the safe withdrawal of American troops, according to an Iraqi description of a Thursday call with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo disagreed with Iraq's version of his call with Mr. Abdul Mahdi and said the U.S. would continue its Iraq-based campaign against the Islamic State extremist group. How long does it have to go, right? Islamic State was supposedly defeated. Are we just going to stay there for the next 100 years because, they might come back? It's so stupid. The whole premise of this thing is ridiculous. The State Department declined to comment on the U.S. warning to Iraq about its New York Fed account. The warning regarding the Iraqi central bank account was conveyed to Iraq's Prime Minister in a call on Wednesday, according to an official in his office. That also touched on the overall military, political, and financial partnership between the two countries. Spokesman for the Iraqi Prime Minister, its central bank, and its embassy in Washington didn't respond to requests for comment. The U.S. State and Treasury Departments and the Federal Reserve Board also declined to comment. Imagine that. The Federal Reserve Bank in New York, which can freeze accounts under U.S. sanctions law, or if it has reasonable suspicion the funds could violate U.S. law, said it doesn't comment on specific account holders. The potential economic and financial fallout is weighing on Iraqi officials as they try to address the presence of American troops without provoking a backlash. In recent days, Iraqi officials have stressed the need for friendly relations with the U.S. even as pro-Iranian militias and politicians exert pressure to expel American troops. Quote, whenever you have any amicable divorce, you still have to worry about the children, the pets, the furniture, and the plants, some of which are sentimental, said a senior Iraqi politician. Mr. Abdul Mahdi has said the departure of U.S. troops is the only way to avoid conflict in Iraq because the U.S. doesn't trust the country's security forces to protect its troops. But there are questions over his authority to evict them, given his status as a caretaker prime minister. Among other potential obstacles are Kurdish and most Sunni leaders who boycotted the session at which parliamentarians voted on the troop expulsion. During the parliamentary debate, the speaker, a Sunni, urged Shiite lawmakers to be mindful of the potential backlash. Quote, one of the steps of the international community could take is to stop financial transactions with Iraq, and we would be unable to fulfill our commitments to our citizens at any moment, Mohammed al-Habousi said, based on a video of the proceedings viewed by the Wall Street Journal. The financial threat isn't theoretical. The country's financial system was squeezed in 2015 when the U.S. suspended access for several weeks to the central bank's account at the New York Fed over concerns the cash was filtering through a loosely regulated market into Iranian banks and to the Islamic State extremist group. Okay, so Obama can send $2 billion in cash directly from the U.S. Treasury, but if they're using their own money through the New York Fed to go to Iranian militias, that's breaking the rules. Geopolitics is a funny thing. Everybody uses big words and pretends like this is all very serious and solemn and all makes sense and is perfectly rational. It's so ridiculous. You get behind the words and you see that this whole world is just mulligans all the way up. It's just shenanigans all the way to the east and all the way to the west. It's just ridiculous. Continuing. Quote, the U.S. Fed basically has a stranglehold on the entire Iraqi economy, said Shwan Taha, chairman of Iraqi investment bank Rabi Securities. The prospect of sanctions has unsettled ordinary Iraqis for whom memories of living under a UN embargo during the 1990s are still fresh. Pro-Iranian and other Shiite factions leading the charge to oust U.S. forces from Iraq have sought to reassure the public by telling them Iraq could pivot to China. An advisor to the Prime Minister, Abd al-Hussein al-Hanain, said that while the threat of sanctions was a concern, he does not expect the U.S. to go through with it. Quote, if the U.S. does that, it will lose Iraq forever, he said. Besides the financial impact, many politicians, including some Shiites, worry that a U.S. withdrawal would allow Islamic State to reemerge as a major threat. They also view the U.S. as a necessary counterweight to Iran, which has tightened its grip on the Iraqi government during Mr. Abdul Mahdi's premiership. The U.S. is concerned that an exodus of American forces could allow U.S. currency to be redirected to Iranian accounts and to other adversaries, according to people familiar with the matter. The Trump administration's sanctions campaign against Iran has squeezed the flow of U.S. dollars to the government in Tehran over the past year. The American dollar, the most widely traded currency in the world, is used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to pay its foreign proxies fighting against the U.S. and its allies in the region, including in Iraq, U.S. officials say. Iranian-owned or controlled foreign exchange houses and banks in Iraq have been an important source of funding for Iran and its proxies active in the country, including those fighting against U.S. forces, U.S. officials say. The New York Fed provides banking and other financial services for around 250 central banks, governments, and other foreign official institutions, such as the account owned by Bangladesh, from which North Korean agents were able to steal $81 million in 2016, U.S. officials have said. When Iraq needs hard currency, its central bank can request a shipment of bills that it then distributes into the financial system through banks and currency exchange houses. While the country's official currency is the dinar, U.S. dollars are commonly used. The New York Fed doesn't publicly disclose how much money it currently holds for Iraq's central bank, but according to the Central Bank of Iraq's most recent financial statement, at the end of 2018, the Fed held nearly $3 billion in overnight deposits. Restricting Iraqi access to dollars could cause the dinar's value to fall, as it did in 2015, which could again trigger a dash for dollars in Iraq as people, companies, and banks try to secure hard cash. Such a devaluation could cause broader economic woes as it cuts spending power for workers, companies, and the government. And that is the end of that article from the Wall Street Journal. Lots of things going on there. Very interesting amid the wider geopolitical play. And that's why, we'll go to some deeper analysis here. This is Strategic Culture Foundation. The writer is Federico Pieracini. And this was from just a couple days ago. It's titled, The Deeper Story Behind the Assassination of Soleimani. Days after the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, new and important information is coming to light from a speech given by the Iraqi Prime Minister. The story behind Soleimani's assassination seems to go much deeper than what has thus far been reported, involving Saudi Arabia and China, as well as the US dollar's role as the global reserve currency. The Iraqi Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi has revealed details of his interactions with Trump in the weeks leading up to Soleimani's assassination in a speech to the Iraqi parliament. He tried to explain several times on live television how Washington had been browbeating him and other Iraqi members of parliament to toe the American line, even threatening to engage in false flag sniper shootings of both protesters and security personnel in order to inflame the situation, recalling similar modus operandi seen in Cairo in 2009, Libya in 2011, and Maidan, Ukraine in 2014. The purpose of such cynicism was to throw Iraq into chaos. Here is the reconstruction of the story. Speaker of the Council of Representatives of Iraq, Halbusi. Quick sidebar, how funny it is that the Speaker of the House in Iraq is Halbusi, and in the United States is Palusi. Anyway, moving on. Halbusi attended the parliamentary session while almost none of the Sunni members did. This was because the Americans had learned that Abdul Mahdi was planning to reveal sensitive secrets in the session and sent Halbusi to prevent this. Halbusi cut Abdul Mahdi off at the commencement of his speech and then asked for the live airing of the session to be stopped. After this, Halbusi, together with other members, sat next to Abdul Mahdi, speaking openly with him, but without it being recorded. This is what was discussed in that session that was not broadcast. Abdul Mahdi spoke angrily about how the Americans had ruined the country and now refused to complete infrastructure and electricity grid projects unless they were promised 50% of oil revenues, which Abdul Mahdi refused. The complete translated word of Abdul Mahdi's speech to Parliament is here. Quote, "This is why I visited China and signed an important agreement with them to undertake the construction instead. Upon my return, Trump called me to ask me to reject this agreement. When I refused, he threatened to unleash huge demonstrations against me that would end my premiership. Huge demonstrations against me duly materialized, and Trump called again to threaten that if I did not comply with his demands, then he would have Marine snipers on tall buildings target protesters and security personnel alike in order to pressure me. I refused again and handed in my resignation. To this day, the Americans insist on us rescinding our deal with the Chinese. After this, when our Minister of Defense publicly stated that a third party was targeting both protesters and security personnel alike, just as Trump had threatened he would do, I received a new call from Trump threatening to kill both me and the Minister of Defense if we kept on talking about this third party. Nobody imagined," and that's the end of the quote, "Nobody imagined that the threat was to be applied to General Soleimani, but it was difficult for Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi to reveal the weeks-long backstory behind the terrorist attack. Quote, I was supposed to meet him, Soleimani, later in the morning when he was killed. He came to deliver a message from Iran in response to the message we had delivered to the Iranians from the Saudis." End quote. We can surmise, judging by Saudi Arabia's reaction, that some kind of negotiation was going on between Tehran and Riyadh. Quote, "The kingdom's statement regarding the events in Iraq stresses the kingdom's view of the importance of de-escalation to save the countries of the region and their people from the risks of any escalation." End quote. Above all, the Saudi royal family wanted to let people know immediately that they had not been informed of the U.S. operation. Quote, "The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was not consulted regarding the U.S. strike. In light of the rapid developments, the kingdom stresses the importance of exercising restraint to guard against all acts that may lead to escalation with severe consequences." End quote. And to emphasize his reluctance for war, Mohammed bin Salman sent a delegation to the United States. Liz Sly, the Washington Post Beirut bureau chief, Beirut bureau, say that 3 times fast, tweeted, quote, "Saudi Arabia is sending a delegation to Washington to urge restraint with Iran on behalf of Persian Gulf states. The message will be, please spare us the pain of going through another war. end quote. Funny that Saudi Arabia doesn't like the idea of a direct war. They were very happy to use their proxies in Syria along with Turkey and the rest of the Middle East. But when it comes to them fighting directly, they can't even beat, the rebels in Yemen, which are Iranian proxies. I don't think they'd fare too well in a direct war against Iran. Continuing. What clearly emerges is that the success of the operation against Soleimani had nothing to do with the intelligence gatherings of the U.S. or Israel. It was known to all and sundry that Soleimani was heading to Baghdad in a diplomatic capacity that acknowledged Iraq's efforts to mediate a solution to the regional crisis with Saudi Arabia. It would seem that the Saudis, Iranians, and Iraqis were well on the way towards averting a regional conflict involving Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Riyadh's reaction to the American strike evinced no public joy or celebration. Qatar, while not seeing eye to eye with Riyadh on many issues, also immediately expressed solidarity with Tehran, hosting a meeting at a senior government level with Mohammad Zarif Jarif, the Iranian foreign minister. Even Turkey and Egypt, when commenting on the assassination, employed moderating language. This could reflect a fear of being on the receiving end of Iran's retaliation. Qatar, the country from which the drone that killed Soleimani took off, is only a stone's throw away from Iran, situated on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz. Riyadh and Tel Aviv, Tehran's regional enemies, both know that a military conflict with Iran would mean the end of the Saudi royal family. When the words of the Iraqi Prime Minister are linked back to the geopolitical and energy agreements in the region, then the worrying picture starts to emerge of a desperate U.S. lashing out at a world turning its back on a unipolar world in favor of the emerging multipolar world about which I have long written. The U.S., now considering itself a net energy exporter as a result of the shale oil revolution, on which the jury is still out, no longer needs to import oil from the Middle East. However, this does not mean that oil can now be traded in any other currency other than the U.S. dollar. The petrodollar is what ensures the U.S. dollar retains its status as the global reserve currency, granting the U.S. a monopolistic position from which it derives enormous benefits from playing the role of the regional hegemon. This privileged position of holding the global reserve currency also ensures that the U.S. can easily fund its war machine by virtue of the fact that much of the world is obliged to buy its treasury bonds that is simply able to conjure out of thin air. To threaten this comfortable arrangement is to threaten Washington's global power. Even so, the geopolitical and economic trend is inexorably towards a multipolar world order, with China increasingly playing a leading role, especially in the Middle East and South America. Venezuela, Russia, Iran, Iraq, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia together make up the overwhelming majority of oil and gas reserves in the world. The first three have an elevated relationship with Beijing and are very much in the multipolar camp, something that China and Russia are keen to further consolidate in order to ensure the future growth for the Eurasian supercontinent without war and conflict. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, is pro-US, but could gravitate towards the Sino-Russian camp both militarily and in terms of energy. The same process is going on with Iraq and Qatar thanks to Washington's numerous strategic errors in the region, starting from Iraq in 2003, Libya in 2011, and Syria and Yemen in recent years. The agreement between Iraq and China is a prime example of how Beijing intends to use the Iraq-Iran-Syria troika to revive the Middle East and link it to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. While Doha and Riyadh would be the first to suffer economically from such an agreement, Beijing's economic power is such that with its win-win approach there is room for everyone. Saudi Arabia provides China with most of its oil, and Qatar, together with the Russian Federation, supply China with most of its liquid natural gas needs, which lines up with Xi Jinping's 2030 vision that aims to greatly reduce polluting emissions. We'll see about that. The U.S. is absent in this picture, with little ability to influence events or offer any appealing economic alternatives. Washington would like to prevent any Eurasian integration by unleashing chaos and destruction in the region, and killing Soleimani served this purpose. The U.S. cannot contemplate the idea of the dollar losing its status as the global reserve currency. Trump is engaging in a desperate gamble that could have disastrous consequences. The region, in a worst-case scenario, could be engulfed in a devastating war involving multiple countries. Oil refineries could be destroyed all across the region, a quarter of the world's oil transit could be blocked, oil prices would skyrocket, $200 to $300 a barrel, and dozens of countries would be plunged into a global financial crisis. The blame would be laid squarely at Trump's feet, ending his chances for re-election. To try and keep everyone in line, Washington is left to resort to terrorism, lies, and unspecified threats of visiting destruction on friends and enemies alike. Trump has evidently been convinced by someone that the U.S. can do without the Middle East, and that it can do without allies in the region, and that nobody would ever dare to sell oil in any other currency than the U.S. dollar. Soleimani's death is the result of a convergence of U.S. and Israeli interests. With no other way of halting Eurasian integration, Washington can only throw the region into chaos by targeting countries like Iran, Iraq, and Syria that are central to the Eurasian project. While Israel has never had the ability or audacity to carry out such an assassination itself, the importance of the Israel lobby to Trump's electoral success would have influenced his decision, all the more so in an election year. Trump believed his drone attack could solve all his problems by frightening his opponents, winning the support of his voters, by equating Soleimani's assassination to Osama bin Laden's, and sending a warning to Arab countries of the dangers of deepening their ties with China. The assassination of Soleimani is the U.S. lashing out at its steady loss of influence in the region. The Iraqi attempt to mediate a lasting peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia has been scuppered by the U.S. and Israel's determination to prevent peace in the region and instead increase chaos and instability. Washington has not achieved its hegemonic status through a preference for diplomacy and calm dialogue, and Trump has no intention of departing from this approach. Washington's friends and enemies alike must acknowledge this reality and implement the countermeasures necessary to contain the madness. And, while I don't agree with 100% of that final analysis, I do think that it is a legitimate analysis. And, the only thing that I'd really disagree with is I do believe that there's a deeper narrative on the side of Trump and, that aspect of the U.S. But I do think on the surface, this very much is a legitimate reading of the situation. That, and I'm not necessarily going to lay peaceful intentions at the feet of all these Middle Eastern players, Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Iran, right? They have their own, violent, incompetent, degenerate leaders as well. And, I don't know about this, idea that they were just coming together to, form peace and it's all Trump's fault that they're not. The thing is, if that's where things are going, then that's going to happen anyway. And the killing of Soleimani throws, a wrench into that in the very, very short term, but it doesn't really do much in the long term. In fact, it foments and certifies that trend by essentially, bringing further common cause to these countries, right, as shown by Saudi Arabia's reaction, which was not very celebratory and very much, reconciliatory. They were like, here, we were not consulted. We urge everybody to calm down. Right, Saudi Arabia, that doesn't sound like people who were glad that one of their, foreign operators, or their enemies was killed, right? And if this story put out by the Iraqi Prime Minister is true, then, it's a very grave situation. And, again, I still think that, especially with the development since the last video, I think that the direction that it's going is withdrawal from the Middle East. Even if Trump says he's fire and fury and sanctions and taking out the Federal Reserve Bank, going with the premise that Trump uses the anger against him to get his geopolitical issues. This is basically exactly another instance of that. He has inflamed the region in terms of anti-American sentiment, and he has also, at the same time, it's a way of consolidating the neoconservative aspect, which now, going into the impeachment in the Senate, this completely solidifies all of the support from the neoconservative senators. Right, it solidifies the support of people who are pro-Israel. The funny thing is with Adam Schiff and the whatnot, this is more of a quid pro quo than the Ukraine thing ever was. But the thing is, Adam Schiff, who's an Israeli dual citizen, doesn't want to, put attention on this and say that was a big problem, because he wants, he wants Iran to be taken out. He wants the Middle East to be thrown into chaos. But he doesn't want to say anything about that. It's only the thing that doesn't matter that he's getting upset about to try and throw it at Trump. So. And, it's very interesting to look back. So the resignation of the Prime Minister of Iraq, this was from December 1st. And, it was after a result of thousands of protesters pressured him. So, at least on the surface, it seems like the story put forth by the Prime Minister of Iraq, could be true. I don't know how much of it is true, but, it resonates with the idea of this greater geopolitical fight between China, Russia, and the U.S., and it would make sense if China was about to solidify its control over Iraq, that, the U.S. would take some sort of inflammatory action like killing Soleimani. So, and just to take it with a grain of salt, Adel Abdel Mahdi, looking up this guy, he's basically, first of all, he's aligned with the Shia, so he's more aligned with Iran to begin with. At one point, he was a communist back in the 70s before he really got on board with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So, he's not, they're all shady characters. Everybody's a shady character in the Middle East, not least of which Abdul Mahdi. But, we'll see. I just wanted to throw that out there because I thought that was a very interesting reading, and it very well could be, true in its core substance. So, final article of today. This is from the American Conservative, written by Peter Van Buren. This was from 2 days ago. It's titled Deep Breaths as We Go from Crisis to Status Quo. War? Iran knows it will get crushed militarily. Trump knows he'd be crushed politically, and Iraq still needs us around. History will judge the long-term impact of the death of Qasem Soleimani. In the short to medium term, let's step back from the fear-mongering and instead focus on the geopolitical factors that make large-scale war many fear unlikely. For Iran to provoke such a war is suicide. They have no incentive to escalate to that level, though they may conduct attacks consistent with previous decades. Those attacks and the U.S. responses will, in the current political and media climate, World War III was trending on Twitter and it frightened youngsters crashed the Selective Service website worried that a draft is forthcoming, consume our attention beyond their actual impact. But they will in reality cycle inside the rough rules of what diplomats call escalation dominance, the tit-for-tat trading of controlling the moment, trying to stay under the victim's threshold of response. Emotion is for amateurs. The most recent series of events bear this out. According to our government officials, Iran and/or its proxies have fired on U.S. bases in Iraq multiple times, initiating the current escalation that included Soleimani's assassination and this week's missiles launch from inside Iran at American bases at Al-Assad and in Erbil. Yet according to one longtime regional observer, quote, this doesn't feel like a major escalation. Iran can claim it took revenge. Feels more like an escalation to de-escalate, end quote. Among other signals, the missile's long flight time, some over 200 miles, gave obvious warning to areas already on alert. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif tweeted that Iran was finished fighting and was not actively pursuing further escalation. Right, that's the other thing. It's like right after the plane went down, they're like, okay, yep, we're done. We've taken proportionate measures, and then just back away like Homer Simpson into the bush, right? But it was inevitable that, people would realize that the plane was shot down. It wasn't technical, mechanical errors. The plane had just been repaired 2 days before, supposedly, one of the best planes in their fleet. So it's basically like Iran shot down, a plane full of its international sympathy. It's very sad for the people on board that plane, but geopolitical, that's kind of the effect that it's had. Trump undertook no immediate counterattack and in a speech spoke only of further economic sanctions alongside some vague thoughts on future agreements. The two countries' actions add up to a collective, we're done if you're done. This was all to be expected. Iranian leaders know their country can be destroyed from the air. As only a regional power, it suffers from a massive technological disadvantage in any direct conflict with the U.S. It is far beyond the days in which Marines were driven from Somalia after Black Hawk Down in 1993, or out of Lebanon after the 1983 bombing of the Marine attacks by Iranian proxy Hezbollah. Unlike years past, America is willing to take a punch to throw back too. Iran's political leaders are aware of the limits of asymmetric warfare in this world, especially because America's lack of dependence on Persian Gulf oil means 2020 is not 1991. Iran, under sanctions, is near totally dependent on what oil it can export. Oil requires massive infrastructure, all of which can be bombed. Iran's military operates in large part out of fixed sites. Its navy is small and its bases can be destroyed from the air. Its harbors mined from above and below the water. Iran's military strength is ranked 14th globally below Brazil and Italy. The U.S. is ranked first. I've been to Iran. I saw the Martyrs Memorial outside the main marketplace in the holy city of Mashhad, with the names of Iranians who died fighting the U.S. in Iraq from 2003 forward. Soleimani has already joined the pantheon of martyrs as of this week, but he is neither the first nor the last soldier to die in this ongoing long war. Iran's government, meanwhile, is a tense coalition of elected civilians, unelected military, and theocrats. None would stay in power following a major war. They face an almost schizophrenic population, happy to chant death to America, but equally open to the idea, albeit on a more liberal terms than 5 American presidents, Republican and Democrat, have been willing to offer, of finding a way out from under sanctions that would release their potential and open them to the world. Iran understands its limits. Think about the provocations that it has been forced to endure without escalation. U.S. troops landing in-country in a failed hostage rescue in 1980. U.S. support for Iraq in using weapons of mass destruction and the provision of intelligence that allowed the Iraqis to rain missiles on Iranian cities in the 1980s. The U.S. shooting down an Iranian civilian aircraft, killing some 300 innocents in 1988, and the U.S. invading and occupying Iran's eastern border, Iraq 2003, and western approaches, Afghanistan 2001, and maintaining bases there. In 2003, when Iran reached out following initial American military successes, George W. Bush flippantly declared them a part of the axis of evil. U.S. forces then raided an Iranian diplomatic office in Iraq and arrested several staffers in 2007. The U.S. has kept crippling economic sanctions in place for decades, conducted the Stuxnet cyber attack in 2010 to destroy Iranian nuclear centrifuges. That was the Israelis. That was not the U.S. And initiated another cyber attack in 2019, never mind what the Israelis have done covertly. Nothing led to a wider war. Soleimani died in context. Iraq, politically and geographically in the middle, has every reason to help calm things down. Despite the rhetoric, the Iraqi government needs the U.S. in situ as a balance against Iranian hegemony and as a hedge against the rebirth of ISIS. The recently passed non-binding resolution for U.S. troops to leave Iraq carries no weight. It was passed by a divided government in caretaker status, applies only to the withdrawal of the anti-ISIS Joint Task Force, and lacks both a timetable to happen and a mechanism to enforce it. Even that symbolic vote was boycotted by Iraq's Sunni and Kurdish, so much for losing the Kurds as allies, legislators, illustrating the difficulties a coalition Iraqi government faces in getting anything done. Should Iraq somehow find a way to move against the U.S. troop presence, promised American sanctions on Iraqi oil would devastate the economy and likely topple a government already besieged by its citizens of all backgrounds for failing to provide necessary basic services. The $200 million in direct aid the U.S. paid Iraq last year is a tiny portion of the billions flowing in from Washington via loans, military assistance, training funds, etc. That all would be missed. Iraq needs a relative state of peace and stability to hold on. It will make ceremonial anti-American actions to appease its Shia majority and make it appear it is not being ordered around by the Americans it loves to hate, but the U.S. is not to be driven out of Iraq. And yeah, we'll see. If the real goal of Trump is not to leave Iraq, then that will be the thing. But I think this is all, take it as you will. I think this is all a very complicated way of getting us out of the Middle East by inflaming the situation so much that it seems to be like we're driven out, but it'll actually be a voluntary withdrawal. Anyway, we'll see how it plays out. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Anyway, continuing. America itself has no reason to escalate any of this into a real war. Iran is strategically more or less where it has been for some time, and there is no U.S. side driver to change that now. Chaos in Tehran serves no purpose, and war would spiral the nation into a series of internal struggles spiced with fissionable material that has no place in a foreign policy calculus in an election year at home. Trump gets the political credit. 84% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents approve of the strike. From his base, where a tough guy move with none of the sticky problems a wider conflict would create. His post-missile attack remarks position him as open to new talks of some kind. To accept the U.S. will start a major war assumes a fully irrational actor unfettered. Many people want to believe that for political purposes, but the hard facts of the last 3 years say that when it gets to this strategic level, Trump has not acted irrationally. Same this time. He did not act irrationally or even provocatively in the aftermath of the Iranian missile launches. It's hard to point to any irrational act, a decision made that is wholly without logic or reason, a choice Trump knew would have dire consequences yet went with anyway. Forget the tweets, they have never added up to much more than fodder for pop psychologists, impulsive remarks not followed by impulsive acts. Absolutely none of the apocalyptic predictions have come to pass. See North Korea, where Trump was supposed to start World War III 2 years ago, or the trade wars that were supposed to destroy the global economy, or any of the other pseudo-crises. In sum, no new wars. Economy chugging along, Trump manipulating Democrats into practically putting Chase-style Soleimani t-shirts up on Etsy. The current commander-in-chief is likely to start a war. He's the only recent president who hasn't. And that's the end of that article. So Peter Van Buren, I guess, was a 24-year State Department veteran. And so, yeah, to close out the article, right, just to make the point that there's really only one sensible option in the short, medium, and long term is to get the hell out of the Middle East, right? Our vaunted Saudi allies, right? The U.S. has just expelled Saudi servicemen over extremist ties and, pedophilia. They had some very bad stuff on their computer in the wake of the Pensacola shooting, right? A Saudi that was training on a military base just went and started shooting everybody. The night before, he was showing all of his Saudi friends videos of mass shooters. Here's his last tweet, where essentially he's saying that he hates the United States. He doesn't hate the people for being American and having freedoms. He hates the U.S. because of its presence in the Middle East and killing Muslims, right? So, I mean, as crazy as the guy was, again, just like Osama bin Laden said, this is their reason. It's not because they hate our freedoms. It's because they hate having their family members killed, and we should stop doing that. On the other side, Israel, right, Netanyahu is, unlike Trump's impeachment shenanigan, right, which is based on nothing, Netanyahu is one of the most corrupt operators in the world, and he is all of his crimes are finally catching up with him. He is basically being prosecuted for corruption. He's trying to ask for immunity from Parliament. Imagine Trump doing the things like that Netanyahu does. In terms of killing Soleimani, sometimes it looks like he does, but there's a very big difference. And so, yeah, Israel's just a total shit show, and a nominal ally, I suppose, but they should, take their own military and their own, weapons and everything and just defend themselves if they need to, and stop using the U.S. as a bully for their own, ulterior purposes. And to close the point, here's a picture of U.S. bases surrounding Iran. It's ridiculous, right? Let's build the wall. Let's, do a national concealed carry reciprocity law so every American can defend themselves. I'm not afraid of radical Islam coming to the United States, right? Especially if we have, taken away their reason to come after us, and we just defend ourselves and build up our own country. It's the only sensible way forward, whether you're liberal or conservative or, whatever. It's time to stop the madness, and I'm really hoping and praying that that's what the ulterior motive on the part of Trump was to take out what was a legitimate strategic operator. As far as targets go, Soleimani was a good target. I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with the strike, but I definitely understand why it was taken. And so if we don't escalate, into a war with Iran, the only inevitable option is for us to GTFO and leave the region and defend our country here at home. So that's my video today. Let me know if you have any thoughts down below in the comment section. Give a like if you enjoyed it. Give a dislike if you're a terrorist, and I'll be seeing you guys next time. Cheers.